She held the camera for roughly 12 minutes, maybe 20. She was not certain about the upper end because, as she later explained, there were stretches inside that room that her mind could not fully account for. Not unconscious, not frightened into blankness, simply absent in the way that certain moments are absent when they fall so far outside the boundaries of normal experience that the brain does not know where to put them. But she was certain about the 12-minute lower boundary because she had checked her watch when she walked in through the first set of doors, and again when the soldiers arrived. 12 minutes. In 12 minutes, she moved around 2 gurneys, framed her shots with the discipline of someone trained in medical documentation, and pressed the shutter approximately 20 times. 20 frames. 20 photographs that, if genuine, would represent the most significant visual evidence in human history. And then a man in civilian clothes removed the film from the camera with what she later described as practiced efficiency, walked through a door, and disappeared into a silence that lasted the rest of her life. Her name was Eleanor Mays. She was a surgical nurse assigned to the Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947. For almost 4 decades, after the morning of July 8th of that year, she told no one. Not her husband, not her children when she had them, not the priest she saw every Sunday at the same church in the same town where she lived a quiet and apparently ordinary life for 30 years after leaving the military. When she finally spoke, in the early 1980s, she did not call a journalist. She did not approach a television program or publisher or anyone with the ability to amplify what she knew. She spoke to a single private researcher, gave her account once in detail, and then returned to her silence. She died several years later, having never added a public word to what she had already said. What makes her account worth examining is not that it is the only one of its kind. It is that it arrived independently from other accounts that rhyme with it, not in every particular, but in the specific way that independent testimonies rhyme when they are describing the same event from different positions in the same room. Before getting to those accounts, you need to understand exactly what the morning of July 8th, 1947 actually looked like, because the official version of events has a timeline that does not hold together under close examination and never has. On July 8th, 1947, the public information officer of the Roswell Army Airfield, a man named Walter Haut, issued a press release on behalf of the base and its commanding officer. That press release stated that the intelligence division of the 509th Bombardment Group had come into possession of a flying disc, not wreckage, not debris, not fragments of a weather balloon, a flying disc. Those are the exact words used in the official press release issued by an official military public relations officer acting under the direct authority of the base commander. The Roswell Daily Record ran the story. The wire services picked it up. By the afternoon of July 8th, it was international news. Then, less than 24 hours later, a general at Fort Worth Army Airfield held a press conference. He displayed debris on the floor in front of photographers. He described it as the remains of a weather balloon and a radar reflector. The story was revised. The press accepted the revision, and the flying disc became officially and permanently a balloon. 2 different statements. 2 different days. The same military chain of command. If you hold those 2 facts next to each other and stare at them long enough, they produce a question that no official investigation has ever answered satisfactorily. Why would a professional military public information officer, operating under direct orders from his commanding general, issue a national press release using the specific words "flying disc" if what had been recovered was in fact a weather balloon? Walter Haut himself spent the rest of his life maintaining that the original press release was accurate. He said this in interviews. He put it in writing in a sealed affidavit that was not opened until after his death. That affidavit, finally made public, stated that Haut had personally seen the object and the bodies inside a military hangar at the base. He described the craft as oval, perhaps 15 feet in length. He described the bodies as small, with disproportionately large heads. He requested that the affidavit be kept sealed during his lifetime because he did not want to deal with the consequences of saying it while he was alive. That choice alone is worth sitting with for a moment. A man who had issued the original press release, who had been inside the room with the physical evidence, waited until he was dead to say clearly what he had seen. That is not the behavior of someone embellishing a story for attention. Eleanor Mays described being called to a restricted hangar on the eastern side of the base on the morning of July 8th. She said she was told by a senior officer that her medical training was needed, not her nursing skills. Her training, as though what she was about to see required a specific kind of professional mental framework simply to process and remain functional. She walked through 2 sets of reinforced doors. The air inside was cold in the deliberate way that cold air feels in an operating theater. Not uncomfortable cold, but controlled cold, the kind of temperature maintained around biological specimens. The smell she noticed immediately was metallic. She compared it to the interior of a battery, a smell with a specific chemical character that she said was unlike anything she had encountered in any medical setting before. There were 2 figures on standard military gurneys. She estimated their length at between 3.5 and 4 feet. The color of their skin she described at length and came back to several times in her account, because she felt the word she kept using was insufficient. The word she settled on was gray, but she was careful to clarify what she meant by it. Not the gray of illness or poor circulation, not the gray of a person near death, gray like something that had developed its pigmentation, or lack of it, in conditions entirely different from sunlight. A gray that was its own thing, not a variation of any color she had seen before on a biological surface. The heads were large, relative to the body, in a ratio that was clearly not within the range of human proportion. The facial features were minimal. She could identify a nose only by the presence of 2 small vertical slits. There were no visible ears. The eyes were closed, or perhaps, she said, they simply had no eyelids in the human sense, and whatever mechanism held them shut was not something she could identify from the outside. The hands, she kept returning to the hands throughout her account. 4 fingers, no thumb. The skin on the fingers had a textural quality she struggled to articulate. She landed eventually on something like a membrane, thin enough to suggest internal structure if light were held beneath it, and on the inner surface of each finger, a subtle banding pattern, a series of fine ridges running laterally across the gripping surface, like the underside of a gecko or the non-slip surface of a medical instrument. She noticed this because she was looking closely, because she was a trained surgical nurse whose entire professional formation had been organized around the careful observation of biological surfaces, and the detail was there, specific enough to describe, particular enough that it was not the kind of thing an imagination tends to produce on its own. She was alone with them from the moment she entered until the moment the soldiers arrived. Sometime in those 12 to 20 minutes, she noticed the camera. It was sitting on a metal tray beside the nearer gurney, a Kodak 35mm Medalist, a model she recognized immediately because the same model was used at the base hospital for documenting surgical procedures. She knew how to operate it. She had operated the same model before. What she found strange about its presence, and what she kept coming back to in her account, was that it had not been brought in by her. She had not brought a camera. No one had handed her one. It was simply sitting on the tray, as though it had been placed there intentionally, as though someone at some level of the operation had decided that a photographic record should exist, made that decision, placed the camera, and then either changed their minds or been overruled, but not in time to remove it before she arrived. She picked it up. She worked methodically, wide establishing shots first, full body, both figures, then progressively closer, section by section, the way she had been trained to document a surgical site. She photographed the chest area of the nearer figure and noted there was no visible rise and fall of breathing, though she could not determine from observation alone whether the being was dead or in some other state for which she did not have a clinical word. She photographed the face from multiple angles. She photographed the hands specifically, spending more time and more frames on the hands than on any other feature, because the hands were the detail she kept returning to mentally, the detail her nurse's eye flagged as the most clearly and unambiguously non-human characteristic of what she was looking at. She said she felt, throughout this entire process, professional. Her word. As though her training had engaged automatically and neutralized the fear or astonishment or whatever would otherwise have paralyzed her. Then the door opened and 4 soldiers entered. One of them, quietly and without any raised voice or explicit threat, asked her to put the camera down and step away from the gurneys. She complied immediately. The camera was taken from her hands. The man in civilian clothes who had entered with, or just after the soldiers removed the film from the camera himself, right there in the room. He did not take the camera to another room. He did not send it somewhere for processing. He opened the back, removed the roll of unexposed film, pocketed it, and closed the camera again. She was escorted out through a different door from the one she had used to enter, walked across the tarmac, and was told to return to her normal shift at the hospital. No one asked her to sign anything. No one sat her down in a room and made her swear an oath. No document was put in front of her. The instruction to say nothing was never spoken aloud. It was simply understood, and it held for the rest of her life. The question of what happened to those 20 frames of film does not have a confirmed answer. But the absence of those photographs is not a simple absence. It has a shape to it. When FOIA researchers working on Roswell-related records in the decades following the incident examined the photographic supply logs from the Roswell Army Airfield, for the first week of July 1947, they found a discrepancy. Standard military procedure required all expended film rolls to be logged and cross-referenced with specific medical or operational case numbers. Most of the rolls from that period could be traced. One could not. It had a case number assigned to it. The corresponding file had been transferred, according to the log, to a federal records facility. When researchers followed that transfer notation, the receiving facility had no record of the intake. A file that had been moved and simultaneously never arrived anywhere. That kind of administrative gap does not prove anything by itself, but it is precisely the kind of administrative gap that tends to appear when someone, working quickly and without the luxury of clean paper trails, has tried to make something disappear from the official record in a hurry. Eleanor Mays was not the only person at the Roswell Army Airfield who came into contact with the unexplained events of that first week of July. Glenn Dennis was the civilian mortician on call for the base at the time, operating under a military service contract with the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. He received a call from the base that he later described in detail. The caller, a military officer, asked him about preservation techniques for bodies that had been exposed to the elements. They asked how to handle biological decomposition while minimizing contamination. They asked about the availability of child-sized sealed coffins, specifically hermetically sealed, in the range of 3 to 4 feet in length. Dennis thought these were unusual questions, but answered them professionally. Later that day, he went to the base hospital on a routine matter and encountered chaos he could not explain. Military police directed him away from certain areas. He saw wreckage being loaded. A nurse he knew from the hospital found him, pulled him aside, and was visibly distressed. She told him she had been involved in an examination of the recovered bodies. She drew figures on the back of a prescription pad, smallish, large-headed, with features she struggled to describe in normal anatomical terms. She told him not to tell anyone she had said this. She was transferred off the base within days. Dennis never saw her again. The GAO investigation conducted in 1995, triggered by a formal congressional request, found something that should have generated far more public attention than it did. The outgoing message logs of the Roswell Army Airfield for the period covering the incident had been destroyed. Not lost, not misplaced, destroyed. The GAO noted in its published report that regulations in effect at the time required those records to be maintained permanently. The reason for their destruction was not recorded. The identity of whoever ordered the destruction was not recorded. What was recorded was that they were gone, that they should not have been gone, and that no explanation for their absence existed in any accessible federal record. Walter Haut, the public information officer who issued the original flying disc press release, spent 50 years watching the military maintain that what he had personally announced in an official capacity was simply a weather balloon. He gave interviews. He participated in documentaries. He remained publicly careful about what he said. And then he wrote his sealed affidavit to be opened after his death, in which he stated plainly that he had been inside the hangar, that he had seen the craft and the bodies, and that the official story was not the truth. His deathbed statement was not a confession of confusion or a concession to wishful thinking. It was a specific, detailed account from a man who had been a first-hand participant in the events, who had direct professional knowledge of what had happened, and who had concluded that he could not go to his grave carrying it alone. The pattern that emerges across these independent accounts does not require you to accept any single one of them as proven fact. What it requires is that you look at them together and acknowledge what the accumulation of them suggests. A nurse who photographed something she described in precise, medical, non-dramatic detail. A mortician who received calls about child-sized sealed coffins that were never explained. A public relations officer who issued the original press release and then sealed his account of what he personally saw until the day he died. A GAO investigation that found the relevant records had been destroyed in violation of the regulations that required them to be kept. A photographic log with a case number that points to a file that officially went nowhere. Each of these details is, in isolation, potentially explainable, but they do not arrive in isolation. They arrive together, pointing in the same direction, from people who had no connection to each other, separated by years and occupations and levels of access, all describing different angles of the same event. Eleanor Mays spent the rest of her life in a small house in the American Southwest. She maintained a garden. She attended her church. She gave her account once to a private researcher, described in precise clinical language what she had seen and done inside that restricted hangar on the morning of July 8, 1947, and then declined to speak publicly again. Her 20 photographs no longer exist in any accessible form. The man who removed the film from the camera walked through a door and into a silence that is now nearly 8 decades old. The case number on the film log points to a file that was transferred and simultaneously never received. The outgoing message records from the base were destroyed. The base's public information officer sealed his account until his death. None of that is a weather balloon. Whatever it is not that. The evidence is not proof. But the absence of evidence in a case where so many specific records should exist and do not, where so many people who should have signed documents did not, where so many files were transferred to facilities that deny having received them, is not a neutral fact. An absence shaped exactly like a cover-up is not the same thing as no cover-up at all. The question of what Eleanor Mays photographed in that room on that morning is still open. The room has been empty for decades. The film is gone, But the shape of what was removed is still visible, outlined in administrative gaps and sealed affidavits and the careful, precise, professionally worded accounts of people who carried something for decades, because they understood, without anyone saying so directly, that the world they lived in was not ready to receive it.